entered seminary, the only picture I had of myself was this one, me standing in the pulpit, speaking lessons of love and beauty, and you, listening with rapt attention, amazed at my insight and wisdom. Well, if you don't personalize your own fantasies, no one's going to do it for you. I seldom pictured myself at board meetings or settling disputes between members. And I never, ever pictured myself making hospital calls or holding people's hands while they wept. And it wasn't because I was cold and hard-hearted. It was simply beyond my personal experience. You see, in my family, no one got sick. No one went to the hospital, and no one died. Well, a few of them died, but all I ever heard about that was not in front of the children. When you were sick, you went to your room until you were better. Someone checked on you from time to time, but it was nothing that you did in public. And on the occasion when someone went to the hospital, it was always while we, the children, were visiting one or the other of the grandparents, and later we would be told, your auntie had a little problem with her tummy. She's fine now. Come home. And even when we were grown and had families of our own, we would get calls like this from our father. Honey, your mother had a little bit of breast cancer, but they got it all. She'll be going home tomorrow. No, they took the whole breast, but she's fine. And when, heaven forbid, your dog died, this was the instruction. If you're going to cry, go to your room. We'll get you another one. Actually, the only time we were allowed to cry was at the movies. I still love sad movies where crying is permissible. I was a little like Buddha before he went off on his pilgrimage, I discovered later. Sickness, old age, death, and loss were hidden from me and my siblings. How was I to know that they were going to be part of my ministry? And yet I think I knew, and I was afraid. At school, I volunteered at the studio where they recorded textbooks for blind students. That I could handle standing on one foot. Then later, I got a little braver and I volunteered for the suicide hotline. This was a little scarier. But somewhere in my training was a warning that I would have to spend one semester in a hospital learning how to be a chaplain. In a hospital where people were sick in public, and some of them even died. When I went for my chaplaincy interview, I handed the recruiter my resume with the 2 volunteer positions prominently displayed on the top. And then below that was my work experience in the business world as a department supervisor. I knew how to handle people. The man read the papers and he said, "Very impressive." Ha, I was in. "It appears you are a take-charge person, a fix-it kind of person," he said. I figured modesty was not appropriate at this point, and so I nodded in agreement. "Well, let me ask you this," he said. "You are in hospital. You enter someone's room and they say, 'I'm dying. Help me.' How will you fix that?" Damn. How did he find my soft spots so quickly? Talk about fear and trembling. But it was during that semester, in the hospital, that I really learned about ministry. Not in the classroom, not in the preaching seminars, but sitting next to someone's bed and holding his hand while he wept, or his wife's hand, or his mother's. There's a lot of weeping in the world I hadn't been aware of until then. How had I missed all of this? Or why had it been kept from me? And later I was to discover that I was not the only one who knew little or nothing about loss and grieving. I remember the time in the hospital classroom with other would-be ministers talking about funerals, about memorial services. The not in front of the children rule had excused me from funerals, so I had no first-hand knowledge of what even happened there. I had been asked to conduct a funeral service by the family of one of the patients I had visited because they were unchurched and I had been kind to their father, and they thought perhaps I would do this for them. So I went home and I collected readings. I learned all I could about the man. I had an idea of how to celebrate that person's life, but I confess that when I was at my computer writing down the words that I would eventually use, I began to cry. So, what if I start to cry when I'm delivering the eulogy? I asked my supervisor and my fellow students. And my supervisor said this: "Then you will be modeling for the bereaved a perfectly acceptable method of grieving." Grieving. Acceptable. That was my first happy lesson in grieving, that crying in public is acceptable. And more than that, I learned it's preferable to not crying or trying not to cry. I had a neighbor once who nursed her husband through 3 years of his dying, and many nights she had cried at his pain and at his slow moving away from her. And when eventually he died, she felt all cried out, and she decided she wouldn't cry anymore. About a week after the funeral, she fainted in the aisle of the grocery store, just dropped like a stone. Her daughter took her to the doctor who had been with her for years, and he asked her, "Have you cried since Ben's death?" And she said, "No, I cried while he was dying, that's enough." And he said to her, "Then you're probably going to keep fainting." And about once a week for a month, she had fainting spells, until one day she broke down and sobbed because she finally realized how much she missed Ben, even missed taking care of him when he was sick. And she quit fainting. Crying is a perfectly acceptable method of grieving, and grieving is a way of healing. I learned later that most people in this country don't know how to grieve much better than I did. Learned that they weren't taught because probably their parents didn't know how either. When I lead seminars on loss and grieving, I ask people what their lessons were as children, and many of them were similar to mine. Go to your room, carry your cross, it will be okay later, don't worry about it, go out and play, don't think about it, he's in a better place, she's an angel now. You see, we have no cultural ritual for loss and grieving. Funerals, 1 or 2 hours set aside, are as good as it gets. We don't shave our heads. We don't rend our clothes. We don't hire people to keen in the funeral procession as they do in some other countries. Older cultures have passages, but it's one that got left out here unless your great-great-grandmother brought it from the old country and passed it on to you. And those passages, those rituals, were suspect for that very reason. They came from the old country, not in America, land of the brave. And men are especially trained not to grieve. When my grandfather died, I caught my uncle blubbing on the sofa, rubbing his eyes with his fists as he might have done as a boy, calling, "Daddy, Daddy, where are you?" And I felt so ashamed for him. I wanted to say, "Go to your room." I met a man like my uncle in the hospital during chaplaincy training. I had been called in by a family whose father, husband, brother, Joseph, was dying, but he couldn't seem to let go. Even the doctors were puzzled by how he held on. His wife asked if I might pray with him and tell him it was okay for him to leave them. And the whole family thought I knew how to do this because I had a little badge that said chaplain. So they left for the cafeteria. I sat with him. I held his hand. I told him his family loved him. I told him that they wanted him to be free from his pain. I said he could let go if he wanted to. I wasn't even sure he could hear me. The nurse came and asked if I would step out a moment while she made him more comfortable, so I went and sat in the hall. And just as she was leaving and telling me I could go back in, a man came down the hall and asked me, "Is this Joe's room?" Turned out he was Joe's best friend since first grade. And he told me it was the first time he had visited since Joe was sick, because he hadn't known what to say. My wife told me I had to come today because I would be sorry if I didn't, he said. But I still don't know what to say. It was the clueless leading the clueless, but it was my responsibility to try. Tell him you're sorry, I suggested. Tell him you're sorry he's sick, sorry that you didn't come sooner. And thus, armed with conversation, he went into Joe's room and said a few words and then came out. I couldn't think of anything else to say, he said. I asked, would he be comfortable sharing a favorite memory of something they had done together? And he said, oh yes, that's a good idea. He went back in and I could see him speaking, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. And again, he came out and shook his head. Oh, I'm going to miss that man, he confided. Tell him that, I suggested. Take his hand and tell him you are going to miss him. It's okay to take his hand, the man asked me. I assured him it was. He went back in a third time, brave man and good friend. He lifted Joe's hand and he spoke a few words. I heard him this time. I'm going to miss you, man. And when he came out, the tears were rolling down his cheeks. I stood to meet him because I wasn't sure he could see where he was going. He put his arms around me and whispered, thank you. When he released me, he said, he squeezed my hand. I'm glad I came. Joe died that night. Perhaps he was waiting for his friend to come say goodbye. Another happy lesson. Even when you don't know what you're doing yourself, you can learn. You can help someone else learn how to grieve. I continued to learn about loss and grieving after I graduated from seminary and I got my first church. I learned about ministry from my parishioners, which I find is the very best way to discover how to be a minister. I had a woman call me one day and ask if she could talk with me, and asked if I could see her. I told her to come ahead right then. She called back a few minutes later and said, I'm not coming, it's silly. What's silly, I asked. The reason I was coming to talk. Oh, come anyway, I said, I've already started the tea kettle. She came in and she sat down. It was clear that she had been crying. I asked her what silly thing had happened that had made her cry. Stone-faced, she said, nothing. My cat died. I asked her to tell me about the cat, and she told me she'd had him for 13 years. She told me how the cat played, how he slept on her lap, that he liked to eat, and what were his favorite toys. I don't know why I can't stop crying over that silly cat, she scolded herself. He wasn't some silly cat, I told her. He was your good friend, and you will miss him. But what must you think of me, she insisted. I said, I think you are a better person than the one who might have come to tell me that you didn't cry. I see this happening all the time. People who think that their loss is silly because someone else's is greater, more important, more significant. No, that's not true. This is what I've learned. There is no loss Olympics. There is no prize for the bigger loss. Every loss is important. Every loss is worth grieving. Every loss deserves grieving. Here's something I learned from a book titled The Grief Recovery Handbook by John James and Frank Cherry. It's the one I use now in my workshops. James and Cherry have created a program they call Moving Beyond Loss. And here's what they have to say. If you don't properly grieve every loss and learn how to heal, when the next loss happens, you'll still be dragging the previous ones behind you. And here's another lesson from them. Loss does not always mean death. When you moved as a child, you lost a whole community of friends. Remember that? And when you had a fight with your best friend, you lost a boon companion. When you lost your job or even quit your job, you lost your identity momentarily. When you grew up, you lost your innocence. When you grew older, you lost your youth. When you graduated from college, you lost your status as a student. When you broke your leg, you lost the ability to take care of yourself. The list is endless. And on top of it, there are pets and loved ones, and all of them need to be well grieved. Here's another happy lesson. It's never too late. It's never too late to grieve an old loss, to learn how to grieve, to know that crying is a perfectly acceptable model of grieving. In my first church was a woman, Linda, who had been part of the community for a very long time. She was president when I was called, and she knew all of the church's history and all of the pitfalls that I should avoid. We had talked a lot in my first year. So when I learned that Linda had suddenly taken ill, or maybe just didn't tell us until it was too late, and was already preparing for in-home hospice, I was devastated. I called a colleague and told her about my own grief, because when I came back from visiting Linda, I knew I wanted to be able to call someone and just start crying without having to explain. To tell you the truth, I didn't know what to expect. How would I face this vital woman now confined to her bed? And yet when I arrived, I was greeted by her cheerful daughter, who introduced me to two cheerful nurses and led me to the door of Linda's room. And there was Linda, propped up on pillows, smiling and cheerful. "Oh, Annie," she greeted me, reaching out for my hand. "I'm so glad you came. I wanted you to see all of this so you wouldn't worry about me." I sat down and I took her hand, still not understanding. She placed her other hand over mine and said, "Annie, I have never known such love." Hospice is one of the happy lessons that I've learned about grieving. I told my own daughter, "Sign me up when the time comes. Don't you dare send me to my room alone." I want to tell you one more story. I took a workshop once that was designed for ministers and chaplains and people who work with people who had suffered loss. At the end, the convener told us she had learned a ritual that made the whole idea of loss and grieving more comfortable for her. She wanted to know if she could share it with us. She called it a ritual for a happy death. She said the one loss that people don't usually want to talk about is their own death. It's scary, she said. No one can prepare you for it, but you can prepare yourself. She said that every month, on a certain day of the month, she takes a full day if she can spare it, a half day if she cannot. She writes letters to people she would miss if she lost them. She makes telephone calls to people who would miss her. She puts her house in order, or some small part of it. She practices a self-examination of her breasts because so many of the women in her family have died of breast cancer. And then she meditates, a rehearsal for one day no longer being present in the world. I've practiced this ritual for more than 20 years. It is very helpful to acknowledge the ultimate loss that we will all experience. I didn't mean to be a Pollyanna today to talk about the happy lessons of loss. I'm not wearing my rose-colored glasses, but let me recap what I mean by the happy lessons. We are all human, and it is human to experience loss. Loss is painful. There are no small losses. Grieving is a skill that can be learned and practiced. It is a skill that should be practiced because it is healing. We are all human, and it is human to be able to heal from our losses. Talking about it with someone is very important. Talking with a friend is not the same as whining, no matter how much it feels like. Your friend is happy to hear you because it means you will do the same for her. Crying is a perfectly acceptable way to grieve. If you don't know how to deal with people who are grieving, the truth is also acceptable. Tell them you love them. Tell them you will miss them. Tell them that you are willing to cry with them. Hold out your hand. Hold on to their hands. We need one another. That is one of the happy lessons. We need one another. It's as simple as that. Please join me